of participants, or rather of presenters for later. And thank you so much, Narissa Irizarry, who is PWN USA's Legal Fellow, Reproductive Justice and HIV Legal Fellow, who is on the call and doing some amazing backup on the technical pieces of the webinar. So due to the number of participants in this webinar, all attendees are going to be on mute for the duration of the webinar. Questions and comments and any responses to questions from the presenters can be entered into the discussion box to the left of your screen. And hopefully everybody can see the discussion box. Oh, I'm hearing that my voice is cutting in and out. Is everyone hearing that? I'm putting the mic closer to my mouth, so hopefully that will make a difference. All right, so welcome. My name is Olivia Ford, and I'm the Communications Director at Positive Women's Network USA, or PWN USA. And again, as I said, Narissa Irizarry, who is based in Oakland, and she's our Reproductive Justice and HIV Legal Fellow, is also on the call. And I'm going to be moderating, though you won't hear too much from me today, as we've got two amazing, phenomenal presenters, Vicky, Lynn, and Valerie Bodeau, both longtime advocates and PWN USA members, who I'm going to turn this presentation over to in just a minute. But that's me, in case you want to face to the voice and face to the name. And for those who don't know Positive Women's Network USA, PWN USA is a national membership network of women living with HIV who are working to prepare and involve all women living with HIV. That's in all of our diversity, including gender identity and sexual expression, in all levels of policy and decision making. And the ultimate vision is to improve the quality, improve the lives, and uphold the rights of women living with HIV and affected by HIV. And we do that by applying a gender equity and a human rights lens to the epidemic. We'll talk just a wee bit more about that as we go into the presentation. And the sheer number of registrants to this webinar just do well to prove a point that's been made and really supported by evidence over and over again throughout the history of the HIV community and coming up to the present day, is that stigma is a key driver of the epidemic. It's a key barrier to that improvement of lives and upholding of rights of people living with and affected by HIV that is so vital to PWN USA's work, and specifically a key part of our work, a key part of our strategic plan, as you see this image right here, is eliminating stigma. We've been engaged in responding to HIV stigma in a number of ways since our founding by 28 Women Living with HIV in 2008. And that work of eliminating stigma is a key part of the work we do and how we do it. Other parts are mobilizing advocates, building leadership, and changing policy, though all of those pieces are intimately linked. They're really inextricable from one another. And again, they make up our strategic plan and the vision for our work. And again, we've been engaged in responding to stigma in a number of ways, some of them involving media accountability work and strategic communications. It's just a couple of examples of campaigns in response to stigma in media that we have run in past years. And of course, HIV stigma stands to undermine the work we do, the lives we live in the HIV community. And that's part of why responding to it is such a vital project. And of course, we understand and display through our work that stigma is not exclusively about HIV. It's affected and augmented by biases and stigmas that relate to race and are tied to race, class, gender expression, sexuality, immigration status, and many other components. And in our work, we really seek to address stigma within that intersectional framework, which is evidenced, of course, by the statement that we released actually this past World AIDS Day on intersectionality and the HIV movement. And you know, eliminating stigma is really not just about shifting narratives, but it's really about changing a culture of devaluing the identities and the experiences of marginalized people And how is culture most actively shared than through language, or more actively shared? And that's why the information in this presentation is so powerful, and talking about the connections between language and stigma is so powerful, and how important it is that as a constituency and a group of people living with HIV and affected by HIV, we recognize that our language has such huge potential for impact, and often stigma is perpetuated through our language and through our actions, in part because we've internalized it from all of these complex sources that we touched on here. And we all have a role to play in eliminating HIV stigma. And here I'm just going to give a special shout out and a special sort of hello to makers of media, journalists, editors, really anyone who's got that power of the pen, or anyone who's got a platform to engage a diverse range of individuals even beyond the HIV community. Being aware of and modifying the language that we use and the language we model to readers and listeners is really a key way to be an ally in strengthening the response to HIV in the U.S. and worldwide. And with that, I am going to introduce our really amazing presenters. We're so privileged to have two incredibly knowledgeable thinkers and advocates and PWN USA members to share insights on this topic. We have Vicky Lynn, who is a doctoral student at the University of South Florida College of Public Health, and she's focusing on behavioral health, and she spent the past several decades being an advocate for HIV issues, and she's a long-term survivor living with HIV since 1985. Welcome, Vicky.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And Valerie Bodeau, I hope that I'm saying that all right, is an HIV testing counselor, peer navigator, speaker, trainer, fitness professional, and she works tirelessly to eliminate stigma through community education and, again, help improve the quality of life for others living with HIV and AIDS. She's also a long-term HIV survivor. And we're really, really privileged to have you both here. Valerie, welcome.
Thanks, Olivia.
Absolutely. And with that, I am going to turn the presentation over to you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Olivia. Valerie and I are really excited about this presentation today and really glad all of you could join us. We want to thank Olivia for all her hard work and thank the PWN for helping make this a reality. Valerie and I first presented this workshop at the PWN's National Leadership Summit for Women Living with HIV in September of last year in Fort Walton Beach. It was such a success that we partnered with the PWN to adapt the in-person workshop to an online webinar. So some of the things we did in the in-person workshop did not translate well to the webinar. For example, at the in-person workshop, we sang a song at the end, so you really don't want to hear me singing over a webinar. So we changed a few things, but the clarity of the message is still intact, and we're really glad all of you could join us. In this presentation, we're going to first talk a little about language and its importance and how it shapes our world. We will go over a brief history of language in the HIV community and examine some public health social marketing messages from the past and how they help to shape the general public's opinion and perception of HIV. We also want to discuss the importance of what's called people-first language, and we'll give you some examples of both stigmatizing and preferred language to use in speaking and writing about HIV. Near the end of the presentation, we'll ask for your input, as this is a very important conversation that we have to have, and we value what you think. So why is language important? So focusing on the use of language might be the first place to start in addressing some of the stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV. Language helps to shape our world. It describes and gives our meaning to our lives. It also persuades and changes minds, and it can destroy or empower people. We hope to empower all of you to think about the language we use and what messages we share with others. When we communicate issues related to HIV, we are all acting as advocates, using language to convey that message. Some of you might not consider yourself an advocate or a messenger, but whether you're a person living with HIV, a provider, a researcher, or other professional, you are all advocates in some form or fashion, and others listen to what you say and how you say it. They listen to the message. And language has a strong influence on attitudes towards HIV and AIDS. So one of the things we want to do when we use language is to empower others. Empowerment is a multidimensional social process that helps people gain control over their lives. It's a process that fosters power in people, in their lives, in their communities, and in their society by acting on issues that they define as important. And we know that there are many issues in the HIV community that are very important, like access to care, medication adherence, housing, stigma, criminalization, policy, mental health. I could go on and on. But the foundation to all these issues is the language in which we use to describe them. And when we discuss these issues, we want to use less stigmatizing language in order to empower the message. And we hope that this presentation helps to empower all of you. I would like to share this quote from the Kaiser Family Foundation about reporting on HIV and AIDS. Because reporting on HIV and AIDS ultimately deals with matters of life and death, and because many people will form their understanding of HIV and AIDS through the media, the story must be approached with clarity, precision, and sensitivity. So firstly, this message emphasizes the key role of the media and communication efforts in shaping public's opinion about HIV and AIDS. And this role brings with it much responsibility and is one of the reasons we're presenting the topic today. The media message can either support HIV prevention, care, and treatment efforts or hinder them. And when we talk about media, we're talking about all media, all communications, newspapers, magazines, articles, blogs. We're also talking about Twitter, Facebook, other social media sites, anywhere and everywhere we speak, read, or write about HIV. Even when we're just talking with our friends and family, when we communicate about HIV issues, we are educating others. So this is worth repeating. Ultimately, the outcome of HIV messaging depends upon three things: the clarity of the message, the precision of the message, and the sensitivity of that message. So now I'm going to take you back in time a little bit, and we're going to discuss some of the history of the language used since the beginning of the HIV epidemic. So let's talk about that language for a minute. And this is nowhere near a comprehensive list of terminology used in the past 30 years, but this will give you a brief overview of where we were and where we are today. One of the terms used in 1982 was the term GRID. GRID stands for gay-related immune deficiency. It was the term used to describe an unexpected cluster of cases in young gay men. Researchers soon realized this new disease was not gay-specific. So near the end of 1982, the name AIDS they started using the term AIDS. And of course, we know AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. We have to remember that AIDS is not actually a disease. It's a diagnosis, a syndrome, a collection of diseases. In the general public, there's still much confusion regarding the definition of AIDS, and people often get HIV and AIDS confused and refer to them as if they were the same thing. The CDC offers this definition: an AIDS diagnosis occurs when the immune system of a person with HIV becomes severely compromised, measured by CD4 cell count, and or the person becomes ill with an opportune infection. We know that AIDS is a diagnosis, and AIDS does not look the same from one person to the next. There are similarities, like the low T cell count. However, the group of diseases or conditions in which a person presents with is often very different. So the term AIDS is very confusing to the general population. They often see AIDS as a disease and not a virus. So this came out many years ago. This message actually helped to shape some of the misconceptions and confusion many people in the general public have about HIV and AIDS. So Magic Johnson, November 7th of 1991, announced that he had been diagnosed with AIDS or HIV and was quitting the National Basketball Association. And this cover of Time magazine came out a few years later. I think it was February 12th of 1996. Millions of people saw the cover of this magazine. However, there's something not quite right about this cover. And most of you can probably already guess what it is. I'm not sure if you can all read it, but under Magic's name, it says he's living with the AIDS virus. And as we just talked about, we know AIDS is not a virus, it's a diagnosis. And again, the general public does not know that. So when we, as people living with HIV and professionals, say AIDS virus, we're helping to perpetuate the misinformation surrounding HIV. So using terminology incorrectly confuses people and helps guide that misinformation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about visual media messages. They're very powerful, and the public health social marketing uses commercial marketing strategies to promote public health messages. This poster came out many years ago and is one of a series of posters that was designed to communicate messages to specific audiences. So public health social marketing strategies are often used to change people's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about a health behavior. So each poster in this series features a child of a different ethnic background. Although the child in the photograph appears to be happy and healthy, we learn from the message that her mother has given her AIDS and she has her father's eyes. You'll probably get tired of hearing me say this, but AIDS cannot be passed from one person to the next. Vertical transmission of HIV may have occurred, but the passage of AIDS is impossible. Also want to mention that these posters represented an emotional appeal to women, African American women in this case, which along with the text suggests that women have a responsibility beyond themselves to be tested. However, there's no suggestion of the father needing to be tested. He just passed his eyes to the child. The next poster, so what comes to mind when you see this poster? The visual message is very different than what the print says underneath. And I'm not sure if you can all read the print at the bottom, but it states, people with AIDS know there's a chance they'll lose their sight, but that's no reason for the people around them to lose sight of the fact that AIDS cannot be caused by touching someone or by working around them, which means the best way to fight AIDS is not with fear and anger, but with compassion and support. The message itself is great, but the group of people look like an angry mob who are trying to keep people living with AIDS out of the workforce. This poster definitely illustrates how visual representation can confuse the viewer. Many people who view this poster never read the small print. This came out in 1986, and at that time, many people living with HIV were losing their sight and losing their jobs. But this public health message, I think, missed the mark in what it was trying to convey, that we were supposed to treat people with HIV and AIDS with compassion. But if you look at it again, it looks like an angry mob. So research indicates that 70% of readers only look at a visual ad. So most people looking at this poster get the wrong message. People rarely take the time to read that small print. So this next poster came out in about 1988, and the People of Color Against AIDS, it was one of their campaigns. So the large print states that AIDS is a white man's disease, and in small red letters it states famous last word. And then in even smaller print it says anyone can get AIDS. But again, most people read the large print, which further fuels misconceptions. So these posters were part of a wider campaign by the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services beginning in 1989, which covered various aspects of HIV and AIDS education. Again, these are a series of advertisements that were targeted for specific audiences. The women in these posters are actually speaking to other women and telling them about their role in avoiding high-risk behaviors and making responsible decisions. The posters on the left places the blame on the man, where the images in the poster to the right places the burden on the women. The written messages combined with the images of the women warns other women that their partners won't always be looking out for their best interests, especially where sex is concerned. And again, they're using the term aid incorrectly. I've only showed you a few posters and media messages that were out in the early days, all of these that helped shape the public's opinion about HIV and AIDS. Although we're 30 years past since many of these posters were out, people still believe these misconceptions and confusing messages. However, there are many more public health messages that are good, and they're actually really fascinating to explore. If you have the time, I'd encourage you to examine some of them and explore what the posters are presenting to the public about HIV and AIDS. Like I said, there's some good ones out there, and I don't have time to review them all here. I do need to have a warning for the next slide. There's going to be a few pictures on the next slides that might be offensive and might be difficult for some of you to look at. So if you do not want to see them, please open another internet browser, close your eyes. I'll kind of go through them quickly, and I'll let you know when I move on from them. So I'm going to change the slide now. In September last year, when I was first putting this workshop together, I did a Google image search on the phrase people living with HIV. And these were a couple of the first pictures that came up. Using shocking images promotes fear of HIV and hinders prevention, care, and treatment efforts. Images such as these shown here are stereotypical images of persons living with HIV and increase stigma and discrimination. Many people still think these are accurate representations of HIV and AIDS. We know that a lot has changed in the past 30 years, but people still have these images in their mind. And unfortunately, these images may still be true in some other countries, and we never want to lose sight of that. But there is still much work to be done to change the general public's opinion about people living with HIV. I know some of you have already opened another browser and are trying to search yourself. Good for you. You can try different terminology, and different pictures will show up, and it's actually very interesting. I do know that many people are working hard to replace some of these horrific images with more positive ones. Okay, I'm changing the slide now, so those who didn't want to look can now look back. So now we're going to talk briefly about a few street slang terms used in the general public to describe HIV. I'm sure many of you have heard these and continue to hear them, words such as dirty, the bug catchers, monsters, she has the ninja or the germ. And also many of you have also heard the question, are you clean? So in order to challenge and counteract the stigma associated with that particular question, there have been a few campaigns. Although I love the Vicky poster, the actual message we want to convey is small, and most people will only read the large print, which they might continue to think it's okay to use the word clean. We always have to remember our audience has a very short attention span, and we must get our message across quickly. And even more recently, there's been a campaign, which I think is great, including images of soapy, sexy shower selfies. I see some of you blushing out there. You must have posed for some of these selfies. We know who you are. Street slang is very difficult to counteract, and it is often embedded in the culture of groups of people, and trying to change these messages is challenging. However, the HIV community has made great efforts in combating some of the stigmatizing message, and I applaud all of you for the hard work you do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about slang in Africa. While I was doing research for this, I came across a website the Iran Humanitarian News, which actually had an article entitled Africa, Mind Your Language. It was a short guide to HIV and AIDS slang in Africa. In this article, Felissa Horn, who studies AIDS and language at the University of South Africa, is quoted as saying, "Language can neither be separated from our thoughts and feelings, nor from the social context in which it is used." He went on to say, words and images create different conceptual reality of the phenomenon. So using different words and visual images can create a different worldview. And we hope that some of what we discussed today can help change your worldview and help to change other people's worldview. And on the next slide, I'm going to actually give you some examples of the slang in Africa that was used, which I just found fascinating. So in the article, they discussed a few of the slang terms. I'm not going to try to pronounce them, but the first one, standing on a nail, is a euphemism for being skinny. It's referring to age-related weight loss. There's another one, departure lounge. It refers to someone living with HIV who is waiting in the departure lounge of death, and that is used in Zimbabwe. FTT, it was a medical phrase, but it's being used as street slang to refer to all children living with HIV. So FTT stands for failure to thrive. And I've actually heard the next term, playing the lottery. I've heard that here in the U.S. So when someone said to have won the lottery, they're suspected of living with HIV. So like I said, there are many more on that website, and I just find it very interesting to explore the terminology of other countries. And I encourage all of you, if you have the time, and hopefully we can talk about some of that at the end of this presentation. So next, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to Valerie. It's the concept of people-first language. I first heard this when I was working on my clinical social work degree. This comes out of the mental health field and is used when referring to people who might be living with a mental health condition. In the classes I teach, both in public health and in social work, I instruct my students to use people-first language. It is important not only for the HIV community, but for all public health professionals, advocates, and others. So rather than using labels to define individuals with a health issue, it is more appropriate to use terminology which describes individuals as being diagnosed with an illness or disorder. Using phrases such as individuals with a mental health illness rather than the mentally ill, or people living with HIV rather than HIV infected are more appropriate. This terminology emphasizes the treatment of a person with a disease rather than simply treating a disease. You don't know how many papers I read and cringe when I hear derogatory language or words that condemn others. So how do we combat some of the stigmatizing languages and images we hear and see? There are a number of ways, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to Valerie, and she will talk more specifically about what we can say and do to help reduce stigma. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki, and thanks everyone for coming out. It's a great turnout. A lot of you folks are from all over the place, so thank you for being here with us. I'm going to focus on some of the language that we use and some of the language that we would be better served using. Language became important to me a long time ago as a fitness professional. I would constantly hear people, especially women, referring to themselves in self-deprecating ways. And it occurred to me that if we keep saying things like, well, I'm fat and I'm never going to be whatever, then that's just going to further perpetuate itself. And I know some of you might not necessarily be on board with this idea yet, but think about it. If we use affirmations and we believe that they're in fact effective for improving our self-esteem and the way we look at life, then wouldn't the reverse be true? do the words that we use about ourselves affect how we think of ourselves? And the words that we use about others may affect how they think about themselves. So it's important to think about the language that we're using, and I encourage all of you to do so. So okay, sorry about that. So that was Vicky's last slide there. Sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. And we've got some images of empowering folks and folks that are doing great things out there. Yours truly is at the bottom. So anyway, the language that we can use stigmatizing language, or we can use empowering language. And for a long time, I hadn't even really thought about the differences and the things that we were using, but it also started to occur to me that some of the things we say just kind of shoot us down. So I feel we should make every attempt to replace the negative messages with positive alternatives. I'm not going to go over every example here. There are a lot of good examples, but there's a difference between stigmatizing and empowering language. And when we talk about an HIV patient or an AIDS patient, we'd be better served to replace that with a phrase like person living with HIV. It's just a little more empowering. To say someone died of AIDS or to die of AIDS, we don't actually die of AIDS. We die of AIDS-related illnesses, but it's still really routine to hear people out there saying, oh, he died of AIDS. People living with HIV, or PLWHAs, as we're sometimes referred to, that's just a little too much for me. I'd rather go with people living with HIV. That's a little bit more empowering to me. So there are a lot of things, and I was noticing in the chat box that some folks were paying attention to that. When we hear the AIDS virus, well, there really isn't an AIDS virus. That should be replaced with HIV. And the HIV virus, well, yeah, that's redundant because that's what the V stands for. So a lot of this stuff we don't really think about, but when folks who aren't as involved in HIV and the industry as we are hear those things, it can also be kind of confusing to them. So when we talk about a risk group, which we often do, and I see it and hear it, and myself have been guilty of using that, if we just say the word risk, that's a little less stigmatizing. And risky or unprotected sex, that is an interesting one for me. I think we need to be a little more specific about what we're saying there, and it's subtle, but when we say unprotected sex, I kind of flash back to the olden days when I went to the dentist and they all came in with like their hazmat suits on. It makes me feel like, okay, you need to be protected from me. But today we've got so many other things out there with PrEP and treatment as prevention and things like that. We need to be a little bit more specific about what we're saying. And there was a great article in Positively Aware in the May-June 2014 edition, and Jim Pickett wrote it. And what he wrote was the CDC even went from using unprotected sex to saying condomless sex. So if it's important enough to the CDC to think about the language that they're using, that tells me that we're on the right path and that we just need to continue to plow forward. And we're going to move on to some of my more favorite ones. I hear it all the time. I hear AIDS victim. I hear contaminated. I really don't want to hear myself referred to any of those ways, and I certainly am not willing to refer to anyone else in that way. So I prefer not to use those. I find those really stigmatizing. And AIDS orphans just kind of conjures up those pictures that Vicky showed earlier. And they're really children orphaned by the loss of parents or guardians who died of AIDS-related complications. I think that we're better served really thinking about all of the language that we use, and sometimes we don't even realize the words that we're using, but I hope that everybody will walk away and think about in my educational efforts or the things that I'm doing in the community, really, what am I saying and what kind of message am I giving across? And so when we say things like an HIV-infected mother, HIV-infected, period, to me is really stigmatizing. I'd much rather say a mother living with HIV. And with mother-to-child transmission, vertical transmission is just a much better term. And Vicky and I talked about this even in the journals that she reads. It's still really common to see mother-to-child transmission, but that implies blame. You know, that implies blaming the mom for the transmission, where vertical transmission is just much more empowering. And when we talk about body fluids, I educate in the school systems. I educate really anywhere that they'll let me stand still long enough to do that. And folks still think that saliva is a body fluid that's responsible for transmitting HIV. It's amazing to me how saliva is the number one fluid I hear when I ask, what are the body fluids that can transmit HIV? So if we just say bodily fluids, I think that we're really missing the mark. We should be more precise about which fluids we're referring to, and we can further educate folks that you can't contract HIV from casual contact. And then moving on to IV drug users, a person who injects drugs or a person who uses drugs is just a little more empowering, and sharing needles is still kind of stigmatizing. Not everybody living with HIV shares needles. Some folks that are in addiction use non-sterile injecting equipment because they don't have choices, especially in places where we don't have needle exchange programs. And then when we talk about prostitute or prostitution, that's just a really disparaging term, and we could replace that so easily with sex worker or sale of sexual services, and that's just so much less stigmatizing. Promiscuous, too, it applies a judgment, and it's accusatory, so that value judgment, any value judgments or words that implicate a value judgment really should be avoided, and we could use having multiple partners as an option. And so when we're talking about the fight against AIDS, that one gets to me a little bit. I've been positive for 29 years and been in this from all angles. And when I think about fight, it just, I picture having my dukes up and, it's just, I don't really want to fight. I want to try and find a better way to get there. So the response to AIDS or AIDS response is just, it portrays us better. It's like Vicky's angry mob earlier on. When I think about fighting AIDS, that's kind of the picture that a lot of people envision, and I'd rather them not see us as a violent lot. And HIV/AIDS, that implies that they're interchangeable. And we see it all the time. I myself have used it for a very long time, but when it's appropriate, we should use the word HIV, and when it's appropriate, we should use the word AIDS. There may be times where they're interchangeable, and I even saw something from the CDC the other day, which I let out a big cheer because it said HIV, and it had the and sign, AIDS. So I know that we're getting somewhere, and I know that we're on the right track, and I believe that each one of us can do a little bit to just make it better. And when I hear people talk about the AIDS test, well, there is no test for AIDS. It's an HIV test, and some things, might just be really subtle and might not sound like they're worth educating someone about, but I feel like every little bit that we do is going to help. One of my favorites is compliance. It's still widely used today and always has been, and the definition of compliant is obeying, obliging, or yielding, especially in a submissive way. The next definition was conforming to requirements, and then obey rules. So to me, compliant is an old term, and I would like to see it go by the wayside, when adherent means sticking to something. I don't know about you guys, but my days of the doctor telling me what I have to do and me having to be in a submissive position with this virus is way gone. So I prefer to use adherent. And I've definitely been met with resistance. Certainly folks tell me, well, you know, this is a medical term. You're not going to change the medical industry. And I understand that. I may not have control over what you or anybody else walks away from here saying or thinking, but I do have control over what I say. And I do have control over how I refer to myself and what my soul hears me saying about me. So I hope that all of you walk away and feel empowered to help folks that you care about use different, more empowering language, but if not, we'll still be here. So moving on, this is really another one of my favorites, and this was really the first one that impacted me in the language that we use when referring to HIV. So if we say HIV infected or when I got infected or things like that, the first thing that I picture is that pussy, oozy sore that you see on your screen. And it occurred to me that I really don't want to think about myself that way. And I think we all know that HIV and AIDS are still not socially acceptable. And I think some of the reason is this is what people picture. When we say we're HIV infected, that picture of that infection is kind of the thing that makes them recoil a little bit, where we could just so easily move on to something more empowering, like saying, I'm positive. I'd much rather picture myself as positive than infected. I'd much rather refer to the people I care about as being positive, HIV positive, or living with HIV. I will often say that I'm living with HIV. We share this body, but I make sure when I get up in the morning that my HIV knows that I'm the boss. So I know that you guys have a lot of questions, and there's still a little bit more, and I actually just saw something in the text box that made me think that another one of the ones that really bothers me, and I'd really love to help us all change, is when folks refer to themselves as HIV. Well, now that I'm HIV, are you? Are you HIV? I think you're positive. Maybe you're living with HIV, but I think that we stigmatize ourselves when we say things like that. And again, my soul hears what I say, and it affects me. Also, when people say to me, well, when I got sick, or now that I'm sick, are you? Because it looks to me like 1,000 T cells and undetectable viral load are pretty good. Are you sick? We say things that we don't even think about, and over the years, they just become commonplace. So I'm going to encourage you guys to think about places where we can change that. And so now here's your chance. Because of the number of people on the call, we can't really unmute the lines, but we've got that text box that we know is working quite well, and we'd like examples from you. We'd like to know maybe what are some terms that you would rather see addressed? What are some more empowering things that we can say as opposed to the stigmatizing things? So you're going to have an opportunity right now. You can start typing the things into the text box that you would like to talk about, and I'm going to finish my part of the presentation, and then Olivia is going to come back to us with your questions and thoughts. So there are things, like I said before, ways that we can refer to ourselves that are just a little more empowering. If I said I was infected with HIV when I was a teenager, it would just be more empowering to me to say I contracted HIV when I was a teenager. Women are most likely to be infected with HIV through heterosexual contact. Well, we already know that the word infected just sends me over the edge, so maybe we could say something like women are most likely to contract HIV, to acquire HIV through heterosexual contact. There are just many friendlier ways that we can say things, but again, if we're not really thinking about the language that we use, then we continue to use it. And then cardiovascular disease has become a major concern among HIV-infected individuals. Well, that's true. Cardiovascular disease has become a major concern, but perhaps we could say among people living with HIV. That's just a little bit more empowering and a little less stigmatizing. So, Olivia's going to come on and help us with some of the questions and comments that you all might have had, and Vicky and I will address what your thoughts are.
Hello, everyone, and the chat box, the discussion box has been hopping, and thank you so much for all of your contributions. Before we get to some of the specific terms that people have been sharing, and the chat box has really been going quickly. Hopefully I've captured as many of your thoughts as possible, and if not, I'll go back and take a look again, make sure I'm not missing too many. But a number of people, including Teresa Sullivan in Philadelphia, this is one that I captured, have been saying thoughts to the effect of, we must start with the internal stigma first to remove the fear and change the way we define ourselves as people living with HIV. That was one comment that has been kind of mirrored and was really powerful. That has come up in the chat box. Just wanted to put that one out there. Some of the other comments specifically around language. Oh, and Vicky, you addressed this one. From Claire from Allen Park, I would like to be referred to as a beautiful, intelligent young woman, not being defined by an invisible virus. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And from Gail, for HIV prevention work, instead of saying healthy, consider whether what you really mean is HIV uninfected. Then I would welcome your comments about that as well. Many people living with HIV are quite healthy. Do you want me to keep reading, or do you want to come in and talk about some of the comments and some of the suggestions?
You can keep. People amaze me, and I love having this conversation because there's so many words in the community that, I'm in Florida, I might not hear them. Other people in other parts of the country might hear different things. People in other parts of the world might hear different things.
No, absolutely.
Is there any, street language that people hear that really kind of irks you and you'd love to see changed?
Or anything.
One of the first comments from the chat box, that was from Amanda Gaither. I didn't get your location, but you can type it in the chat box and then I'll have it right in front of me instead of scrolling back. In terms of street language, has heard booty flu. That's not one that I've heard before. Cecilia Macbeth says, I come from Africa. Here, one we'd hear too there is, you have big brother or the big one. And whenever anyone loses weight unexplainedly, they're labeled as having an AIDS diagnosis or having AIDS. So in terms of street language, just a couple of ones that I definitely have not heard either. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing.
Yeah, and Wahida just shared the word consumer. I know that's used a lot, especially in the education world where I am, when we talk, should we say patient, should we say client, should we say consumer, should we just describe the person? And for years we used the term consumer, but I think, there's a movement now to go back to client or patient. And I guess it just depends on the context in which you're talking about. Like a mental health counselor might say client, but a doctor is going to refer to you as a patient. So that's very interesting. Yes, I don't, consumer is not one I like it either. Thanks for sharing that.
I, too, am not very fond of consumer, and do everything I can to try and change that as we move forward, because I feel like that further stigmatizes us as well. And if we just say client, it's really the same thing.
And somebody asked what I meant by street language. And street language is just like the one slide I showed you where people talk about the ninja, the bug, things like that aren't used in scientific research or in a professional sense, but things you hear on the street that people are talking about.
That kind of language generated from community, sort of community-based language might be a term, I wonder. But I guess it sort of begs the question, what community? Or common, like sort of slang language. Let's see, I'm looking for other language points. There are so many. There have been a couple of points around that patient should only be used by clinicians to refer to their quote-unquote actual patients. So I'm hearing also that client is really kind of appropriate in all situations, potentially. Any thoughts on that?
I think client is good when, and again, it depends on who's using it. It's probably not something we'd hear on the street or in the HIV community. We would probably just refer to people living with HIV. But client is a good one. There is one thing, I kind of skipped over it when I was talking about the terminology in the beginning of the presentation. The United States and the World Health Organization are actually starting to move away from saying AIDS at all. The U.S., there's some definitions. There's 3 stages. There's initial infection of HIV, there's a second stage and a third stage. The third stage in the U.S. is what we now consider AIDS. And the World Health Organization actually uses 4 stages to define HIV progression. There's some information online. You could probably search and look for it. I personally would like the term AIDS to just kind of go away. And late stage HIV, end stage HIV, stage 3 HIV, stage 4 HIV, because those are terminology that's used in other medical conditions. So I like the stages. Now, I don't know, maybe a long time before we ever, really can use that in the community on a regular basis, but I really prefer the stages. Any thoughts on that?
And when we think about it, it's important, even if we just pick one. When we were at the Positive Living Conference, I have a friend who always keeps saying to me, well, you're never going to change the medical community. Well, you're never going to change this, with words like infection and compliant and things like that. But there was a doctor there who the very first words out of his mouth, he was the keynote speaker, and he said, we need to watch the language that we use, which lets me know that if we approach this from all angles, from the medical community, from our perspective as people living with HIV, from folks who are educating from every angle, then we have a better chance of making a change. And I work in a medical clinic where even our doctors refer to patients as clients. It just helps you not to feel sick. And I'm also looking at, in the chat box, from Claire Gasamadera. I'm sorry if I am butchering your last name. And she brings up an important point that we hadn't really touched on. Generationally, there are going to be different things that we say. Folks that have been in the medical community for a really long time will probably always say compliant, will probably always say infected. But folks who are new to this, who are new to living with HIV or to educating or being in the industry in any way, might not pick up any of those terms. They might just right off the bat say condomless sex. But if we don't approach things generationally as well, I think we're missing the mark.
Claire also talks about promoting hopeful language, which I think is fantastic. because HIV is now considered a chronic health condition, and this means that those of us living with HIV can expect to live a full lifespan as long as we take care of ourselves, take our medication. Yes, and there's, oh my gosh, we can be very hopeful of the future, and we can do whatever we want. I don't know if you guys noticed, this year I'm celebrating 30 years living with HIV. I'll be 50 years old this year. So I am so grateful to be alive. And I'm also pursuing my doctorate degree, which, 25 years ago when I was homeless sleeping under a bridge, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think this was possible. So I want to let all of you know that no matter what life throws at you, don't allow your diagnosis of living with HIV stop you from going after your dreams. It's all possible. You can do, I'm just amazed, you can do whatever it is that you want, and hopeful language fits perfectly into this conversation. Thank you, Claire.
Oh, sweet. Now, speaking also of the idea that I think I see a comment on here from from here in New York, that in terms of stigma, this is from Anna Vieira, that I think we should keep in mind that in terms of stigma, that stigma is often contextualized. What is stigmatizing for one person or community can be empowering for others, especially given the history of taking back terms, which I think is important, especially in the considering the fact that I think that there have definitely been several folks in the chat box. I'm sorry if I didn't get everybody's name, who've talked about the fact that the positive language, say I'm HIV positive, is actually for some individuals, for some folks, actually empowering. So it's interesting that there's a range of choices and options, and that folks may fall in different places on a spectrum of language.
Yeah, Valerie and I spoke about that earlier today, because it does, for some things, for some people may be empowering, for others it may not be empowering, and use whatever's empowering to you personally. We hope that the HIV community as a whole can move towards using more empowering, less stigmatizing language, and this presentation was just a step in that right direction. And absolutely, whatever is empowering for you, please use those terms.
Mm-hmm, indeed. So we can talk about a few more comments from the chat box, or do you want to move on? How are we doing?
I think I'm surprised that we're almost to the end of the presentation. We were able to get through a lot. We thought that it would take a little bit longer. So I'm okay ending early unless somebody wants to talk a little bit more about any issue regarding language.
Is it all right if I put one out? Because there's one that's been coming up a few times in the chat box around the language around ending AIDS and getting to zero. And just speaking of language that's empowering versus not so empowering for depending on who one speaks to, I think that there's, again, from just based on the comments here, and also ones that I have heard and conversations that I've been in and that we've been in as an organization, I think it was, I'm going to find the person's name here, that basically the ending AIDS or the end of AIDS implies that we're going to line up the people living with HIV and shoot them was the comment, a very strong comment in the chat box, because even though it implies sort of no new cases of HIV, no more sort of zero people becoming HIV positive, zero deaths due to AIDS-related complications. That's sort of the same small print that you talked about earlier in the presentation that doesn't necessarily come across in these kinds of big-ticket communications campaigns. Do you have any thoughts about that, sort of the ending AIDS and getting to zero language?
I was talking with Valerie earlier on this as well. it drives me a little bit nutty when I hear end AIDS, because I'm not sure if we're wanting to end AIDS or end HIV or both. Ending AIDS is actually simpler than ending HIV. You know, if we can get people in care and treatment and reduce AIDS diagnosis, we possibly could get to zero AIDS diagnosis. Now, getting to zero HIV is a whole nother ballgame. So I think it is, although I think it's a great campaign, yes, we want to, get to zero, but are we meaning zero AIDS diagnosis, or are we meaning zero HIV? And I guess that depends on who you're talking to. But I think that the message can be a little bit confusing for some.
And in a perfect world, we'd be able to address all of this, and change everything right off the bat. So I don't really know that I believe that's possible. But what I think is that if we pick what's important to us, what's important to each individual to try and tackle, and if ending AIDS is the one that really ruffles your feathers, then Vicky and I agree. What she just said, I echo. Then take that one on. But I'm also seeing a lot of other questions in the chat box about stages and how that could be more confusing. Yes, it might be more confusing to use the stages, but I find that when people hear the word AIDS, it's a completely different response than when they hear the word HIV, and I just think that we would have some better inroads with certain folks in certain communities if we were able to change that as well.
And somebody brought up full-blown AIDS, and I think I just skipped over that when I got nervous in the beginning of the presentation. The term full-blown AIDS drives me absolutely batty, and I hear it over and over and again, and I read it over and over and again, especially in research journals and the hard sciences. There is no such thing as full-blown AIDS. It should never have been used. It should not be used today, and many of us have stopped using that term years ago. Yesterday, I did a Google search. I typed in full-blown AIDS, and I could not believe it, but an article that was published 2 days ago on somebody's blog, in the title, was full-blown AIDS. And my jaw just dropped. I guess it irritates me that if people are going to write about those of us living with HIV, that it's important that they understand the correct terminology to use. And the term full-blown AIDS just drives me crazy, and I see it on Facebook a lot. And I do want to correct people, but I don't, because I don't want to be known as the language police. But that one, and it's still being printed in research journals today, so that when we become participants in a research trial, when we're talking with professionals and they're using language that's stigmatizing or language that's not appropriate, it's okay for us to correct them. That's part of being an HIV advocate, because the researchers, the professionals, they can't keep up with everything. Believe me, the world is very stressful. But us taking the time to say, no, we'd rather you use this term when you're referring to us. We'd rather you talk about us in this way, then we can start changing. Because I think for researchers, they're so used to writing this way and reading this way, they've used it forever. And then when they go out in the community, they're using the same terminology, and people are hearing that, and it just perpetuates and continues. And for us to be able to stand up and say, wait a minute, we don't like those terms used when describing us, I think then we can start to make a difference.
And I agree. I also think it's important to think about how we do that, though. I think that we need to do it in the least confrontational way possible. I think it's important that we get folks to understand what our mission and our goals are with changing the language, but I think that it's also really important to do it in a non-confrontational way.
Yes, absolutely.
I think there's a way, I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
I just wanted to add a wrinkle to the idea of talking about it in a non-confrontational way. I think it's really possible to talk about I get the sense that it's possible to talk about these challenges around language and where whether it's individuals, families, or professionals can change their language in a way that really frames it as who wants to be responsible for propagating HIV stigma and continuing the presence of HIV stigma. This is an opportunity really for all of us to be on the same side. It's really, the way that I frame it is sort of all of us against HIV stigma, not me against you because you used language that I know to be inappropriate. So just going forward, it's a way to think about framing those kinds of conversations, because it really, until if we can't control whether someone becomes defensive or whether they themselves have some kind of they're having sort of a trigger at being challenged or being responded to. But I think that you're absolutely right. There's definitely there's a way to talk about this as an opportunity to talk about changing language as an opportunity to be an ally, and not as an us against you kind of setup.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia.
Yeah, absolutely. Just putting in 2 cents. There is actually a question which I think impacts a lot of folks who work in HIV, who speak about HIV, who speak about living with HIV and write about HIV, from Siraj Maduri about abbreviations. I wondered if I could put that out there as we're kind of wrapping up and addressing a few questions. This is from the chat box. For abbreviations, I wondered if you talk about what is a non-stigmatizing way of abbreviating people living with HIV. I've seen PLHIV, PLWHA, PLHA, etc. I'm worried that people use many of these interchangeably, though clearly using quote-unquote AIDS is stigmatizing and not accurate. And I wondered if folks who, within the sound of my voice, and also who are able to use the chat box, and also you, Vicky and Valerie, have any sort of thoughts or responses to that.
For me, I know that we want to shorten everything. We want to give everything acronyms and letters so that we can shorter, because I know in the research community, word count is so very important. And if we can shorten our words, that PLHIV, instead of writing it all out, it drives me insane a little bit. I don't think it needs to be shortened, but I know when we're paying for print things and stuff like that, we have to pay per letter, but I would prefer not shortening it and just keeping it as people living with HIV. But that's my opinion.
I absolutely agree with Vicky, and I feel like that if we take that step, and yes, maybe it's a little bit longer and maybe we have to compromise somewhere else, but if we take that step and actually spell it out, person living with HIV or woman living with HIV, I think it's just going to better serve us over the long haul anyway.
Yeah, and so somebody mentioned that when they're in chat rooms and typing and stuff, it's a lot easier to abbreviate. I agree. I do agree that that's easier. I think I'm mostly talking about papers, conferences, things that are going into where the general public is going to be viewing it. I think it's more appropriate to spell things out.
Yeah, definitely, I hear you.
You guys I'm so impressed with everything that you're saying in the chat box, and I'm really happy that we're able to have this conversation today.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And it's funny, I'm reading the comments in there, and folks are sending us private messages encouraging us to be the language police.
Duly noted. And, there are also a couple of questions about resources, definitely about having this presentation available, and it is being recorded again. So the presentation itself will be available in the slides. We've already sent those around a couple of times for folks who were unable to come on and see the webinar itself to be able to follow along. But those are really excellent questions regarding what kinds of resources we need in this community in order to disseminate this kind of information and what kinds of materials work best for whom. And I really encourage you all, again, I'm not just plugging the survey just to have people fill it out, just, because I want to see more people fill it out, but we want your feedback. There's a space in the survey to talk about what additional resources and what additional, whether it's webinars or whether it's documents, what kinds of additional materials we needed. There's so much knowledge represented on this call and represented on this webinar, absolutely from the presenters and also from everyone who's listening and sharing on the chat box and just and listening quietly. Fill in your feedback, definitely, so that we can have that and have your perspective and have your recommendations for what could be produced going forward to actually respond and challenge some of these some institutions where we've talked about maybe it's a little bit more challenging to get them to change language and change culture. But it's going to take all of us. So any feedback that you can provide as to what you would want to see produced, please do. Absolutely.
And at the end of this presentation, I've included my references, so that it's information that you'll be able to go look for, because some of what we're talking about today was talked about many years ago. It just hadn't disseminated into the general public yet. So the Kaiser Family Foundation has a manual about reporting on HIV and AIDS, which I think is absolutely invaluable. There's also two terminology guidelines, one put out by UNAID and the other one put out by the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Both those references are at the end of the slide, so you can go, they're online, you can find them, and a lot of what we talked about today, they've talked about in their manuals.
And I would encourage you guys to do that. There's some really great information there, and we realize that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that we're starting this conversation and trying to see where we can go from here. So like Olivia said, your feedback is really important. And then we do have a few more slides, Olivia, whenever you're ready.
So, yeah, I think we're,
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and move if you'd like to move on. I think that's fine, yeah.
Okay, and there's contact information at the end, so if you still have questions or if anybody has thoughts they want to get to us, they can as well. And really, what's next? I mean, this really was just the tip of the iceberg today. Vicky and I talked about so much that we could include, and we could have just done hours and hours on this, but what we really wanted to do is provoke thought. We want everybody to think about, what am I saying, what am I hearing, how can I make a difference? And really, to me, it's important for those of us that are living with HIV, how am I referencing myself, and how am I referencing the people that I care about, and making sure that I'm doing that in the least judgmental, least stigmatizing way. And we can all use appropriate and empowering terminology, and we can encourage the people that we care about to do that as well. Non-stigmatizing language and images is really important. When I go into middle schools and high schools and I disclose my HIV status, the kids are shocked because even middle schoolers who never saw the carnage of the 80s are convinced that it's only skinny white men with sunken cheeks and sores on their arms that could be living with HIV or AIDS. And I think they get that because our media has not caught up with reality. So I think that we can all be responsible for helping that to happen. I mean, even look at the most recent movies portraying HIV and AIDS. They're all based on the 80s. You know, there's not a lot of really great information out there today, so that's what folks are still walking around thinking. So I think that we can all play a part in changing that. And when we're portraying people living with HIV, it's important to do that in a positive way and not depressed or ostracized unless that's the point of the article or of the picture. I think the media oftentimes uses that for sensationalism, and it really is counterproductive. So we definitely can empower ourselves and we can empower others to make a difference in the language that we use. And right before we went to the conference in Fort Walton Beach to present this workshop the first time, Vicky and I both saw this picture, and it sums everything up really well for me, and I'd like to thank the Stigma Project for everything that they do. I am not dying, helpless, sick, being punished, guilty, or dirty. I am HIV positive. And if you're not able to see the screen, it also says, update your thinking, end the stigma. And I think that's a great line. And in the Stigma Project, they talk about being HIV neutral. There's people who are HIV positive and people who are HIV negative, and how we can all work together, and it's really important. So from my end, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you for all the hard work that you did, Olivia, and for helping us with this. And most of all, thank you, Vicky, for helping bring this important topic out, and for all the work that you did. And so our contact information is here at the end, and if there are any additional questions, we have maybe a minute or two.
Yeah, if there are any questions that folks want to enter in the chat box while we've got our presenters here for a few more minutes, feel free to enter them now. And if not, definitely take a couple of minutes before you go, to fill out that survey. Again, the feedback and the knowledge that you have is so important. Oh, someone has asked, what about language HIV and the transgender community and transgender communities? And I'm going to go back to the contact info slide because someone else was asking about that so that they could see the contact info. But
yeah, I personally have not worked with the transgender community, but I think we can find some resources and yeah. Thanks, Olivia.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I too have not worked directly with the transgender community, but maybe for future reference, we could bring someone in and find out specifically some of their thoughts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, I definitely know that that was Thomas in Flint, Michigan. Thank you so much for that question. Really, really vital question just in terms of, I think that we could have a whole presentation on stigmatizing language that's used to describe or to deride trans communities. I see a response in the chat box. I work with trans communities and would be glad to participate in that kind of conversation. Claire Collins, thank you so much. And it's a really important question and comment and experience to bring up here and bring to the table here. So thank you so much for that. I am resending the survey link. Someone has asked for the survey link. Please definitely fill that survey out. Oh, folks are asking about certificates of participation. You know what? I'm going to go forward to the slide that has my contact information, and if that's something you need, drop me an email. Center for Excellence in Transgender Health is a really, really excellent resource. They just were given a shout out in the chat box. Thank you so much, Joseph, from Miami. No, there are so much excellent resources and so many excellent responses and comments and richness coming out of this chat box. I'm going to try and capture all of the text from the chat box as well. And I'm going to I'm just going to keep on sending that survey link. And when we end the meeting, though, you'll also go to the survey page. It won't end for a few minutes because I'm going to work on getting the chat box text up, but just know that when the meeting ends, you'll also go to that page, but please also feel free to go on your own. Any final questions for our presenters? Any final comments, Vicky and Valerie? Thank you so much for this amazing, and again, timely, as a couple of people have said in the chat box presentation. Any final comments?
Just thank you to you and the PWN for making this possible, and thanks for everyone who who participated. It's just amazing, and I can't wait to reread all the comments and stuff because it will help to make this presentation and other ones just like it better.
Yeah, and I too just like to again thank everyone for being here, and the comments. There's some really great comments in there that unfortunately we didn't get to all of them, but well, some of you guys have really great information, and don't hesitate to contact Vicky or I. We're both looking to improve and move forward with this. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Again, please definitely go to the survey page, fill out the survey. Sarah Jackson from Baton Rouge, I think you were meaning to send this message to everyone. Thanks, everyone, for the presentation. Keep going strong. You as well. And, yeah, thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone. I'm going to send, when the recording is available, I'm going to send it out to definitely all attendees and possibly all who have, who even registered, because there were many people who registered who weren't able to attend. There were a number of people who registered who were, we were at capacity. I don't know if anyone knew this, but past 200, I believe, no one else was able to come on and see the webinar. So we'll send it out to those folks as well. So there's definitely opportunities to see it again. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.